This is Sue Ellen Zagrabelny, and welcome to BookBeat. Today my guest is John Odell, author of The View from Delphi and The Healing. John, welcome.
It's good to be here with you, Sue Ellen.
Well, thank you for joining us today. Tell me a little bit about your background as a writer and how you came to writing.
I came to writing pretty late. That was about 16 years ago. I was 45 years old when I decided that I would write. Before that, I was a business consultant and worked with executives and did team building and strategic planning here in Minneapolis, and got to the point where I was successful at what I was doing, but I didn't feel my life was fulfilled. So I decided that either I was going to kill myself or I was just going to have to leave it all behind. So I sold my business and sold the house and broke up with a partner and moved into a small studio apartment and decided I think I want to write. So I started on a novel about growing up in my home state of Mississippi, which became The View from Delphi.
Oh, that's interesting. I wondered how, coming from Mississippi, how you ended up in Minnesota.
Well, that's a different story. When I was about 29 years old, living in Mississippi, I was dealing with being gay. I had not admitted that, but I was certainly acting out, and also to handle that, I was drinking a lot. So my life was just out of control. And I decided that I needed to get out of Mississippi before they threw me out. So I had luckily been apprenticed to a large consulting firm down south. Mm-hmm. So I knew the consulting business. When I applied for jobs, I saw one in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I had never been to Minnesota. I had just seen Mary Tyler Moore, and that was it. I knew nothing about the state. But it was far enough away that was interesting. Plus, it was on the other end of the Mississippi River, which was intriguing. So I just took the job just to get out. And the state was really good to me. I kept the job for about 6 years and became an executive vice president and sobered up in the process and discovered that Minnesota was the land of 10,000 treatment centers. And and after I had about 6 years of sobriety and a lot of success with the consulting, I decided, this is not what I wanted to be when I was a kid. And that's when I left it all behind and went into writing.
Oh, so it ended up being up here that you put together the writing career.
Yeah, I had to come here to get sane. I was growing up in Mississippi. Most people are, and I was among them, very crazy. We have a strange a knot of sex and religion and race, which we're born into, and it's an entanglement. And I had to come here to kind of dig to the bottom of my motivations, and decided the best way to deal with that was to write about it.
Thank you. That's really an important thing to find out about yourself, I would think.
It was everything. It was. I think we're all born into certain narratives. Our family narrative, the story of our family, the story of our culture, the story of our ethnic group if we have one. And as growing up as children, our jobs is to master those stories, to learn the story of our people, and not to vary from it very much, or we embarrass our people. We want to fit in. And I think if the first half of our life is about mastery, I think we get to the second part of our life is overcoming the first part, which is learning your own stories and the truth about who you are, and not the family picture or the cultural picture or the Mississippi story. So yeah, coming here was about finding out the truth, especially around those three areas, around sex and around religion and around the way that I was brought up racially as a white supremacist. That was my story that I was trying to live.
Oh, that must have been an eye-opener to go through that and discover the information that it sounds like you didn't have as a young man growing up.
It was difficult, especially when I go back and deal with those people I grew up with. with my parents and realized, oh my gosh, this is where my racism comes from, or this is where my homophobia comes from, or this is where this belief in a God who's a punishing God and a hellfire God and a guilting God. These are the people that I get that from. So in a way, you don't go and disappear anymore into your home. You stand out. And you have to decide, how much am I going to say and how much am I not going to say about this to keep my own truth. So I think that's a lot about sobriety. The first couple of years is easy because all you have to do is quit using your drug. So 2 years of not drinking was easy. The hard part is then, after you're sober for a while, is going back and looking at those wounds, the reasons why you drink. And you realize you carry a lot of wounds for your people.
Oh. How did that story come to be the books that you've written, the View from Delphi?
Yeah, after I decided I was going to write, and it wasn't immediately. I mean, I was in therapy at the time. I'd gone to my therapist and said, look, I'm making more money than God, and I've got a house in Golden Valley I've got the postcard, a partner. He's gorgeous, and I've got big cars, and I want to kill myself. I said, this is everything that I thought I was supposed to want. This is everything that was supposed to make you happy, and I'm no more depressed now than I've ever been, even with, at that time, 15 years of sobriety. And he said, that's because you hate what you do. And I said, well, my father told me that, if you find a job you only hate 90% of, you got a damn good job. I said, what has hating your job got to do with it? He says, because you don't have to do it. Now you have the hardest question to answer in your life, halfway through your life at 45, is what do you want to do? You've never even asked yourself that. And I said, well, how do I handle this? And he says, first you have to quit saying no to all the things that hurt. And then you'll have to wait patiently until a yes comes along. But you got to get the stuff that hurts out of your life. And I could afford it. That's when I decided to go home and sell my house and break up with my partner and realize that everything that I let go of, I felt more energy. It felt like a release because everything was such a burden, even the relationship that I was in. So when I gave away all my possessions almost and moved into a studio apartment, I felt like I was more full of life than I'd ever been. It was opposite from what I'd been told. I still didn't know that I wanted to write. So I went to my therapist again. I said, okay, now I've gotten rid of everything and I feel great, but what do I do? And he says, well, my guess is you knew what you wanted to do when you were a kid. I said, really? What was it? And he says, well, I'm your therapist. I'm not your psychic. He says, you're going to have to remember yourself. And when you remember, you'll remember, but you've got to do it. And I said, well, what do I do in the meantime? He said, travel. You can afford it. Go travel. I said, okay, I'll go to London. I'll go to Ireland. I'll trace down my roots. And he said, no, you don't understand. You have to go to someplace you don't speak the language and go by yourself. I said, why? He says, because you spent your entire life controlling other people and controlling outcomes and doing 5-year plans and making sure your life has no surprises in it. That's the joy is gone. You're going to have to go to a place where you have to surrender, where you have to ask for help, that you have to depend on other people, and then listen. And he was a genius. I went to Costa Rica. I spent 3 months in the jungle, and one morning in a tree house with the howler monkeys, it was like, oh my God, I want to write. And I'd always had that in my mind, but never before had I had the memory, the excitement that I had as a child about wanting to create characters, wanting to create stories. And it no longer was it an intellectual exercise. I just found the passion that I had as a child. I was like, oh, I want to write a story. And for the first time, I didn't feel shameful about that. So I came back and I decided I wanted to write a story. And so the only story I knew was the story of Mississippi and growing up with my parents. So I put them in a book, and I did like most authors do, their first draft. I wrote a book to get even with everybody that had ever abused me. So I wrote a book to get even with my mother and my father and all the bullies and all the preachers. And it was it was nothing more than a morality play. But it was all my anger that I had to get out on the page. I talk to a lot of authors now when I consult with them, and they say, I can't write all this stuff down because it's so ugly. And I said, well, you got to write the ugly stuff down because that's what's in the way of the beautiful stuff. But you got to go through the ugly. You got to go through the anger. You got to go through the whatever it is, the poor me. And luckily I had a coach at the time who helped me through this process. And just a story, I took this unedited book down home, and I was so proud of it. And I wanted my mother and father to read it. And I put especially my mother, I put every story of her abusing us, of her going on drugs, of her wrecking the car, or of her running over my dog drunk. I just wanted to get even with her. And also I put all these horrible stories in it and showed it to my father first. And he said, you can't let your mother read this. And I said, why? And he said, she'll get drunk and get in the car and go have a wreck. I mean, you'll push her over the deep end again. She's been doing so good. And I said, no, she's got to read it just in case Oprah sees it, which is why I just wanted her to read it. So I gave it to my mom to read. And she spent the whole weekend in Dad's lazy boy, turning one page after the other manuscript page. And toward the end of the book, I saw that she was starting to tear up. And now I'm back. I'm a 6-year-old kid again who's supposed to take care of his mother. Look, I've hurt her. I've destroyed her. And of course, I have a master's degree in counseling psychology. So I knew exactly what to say. I said, well, Mom, it looks like you're having some feelings. She said, wait a minute, I got to finish the book. And she ended it. And she was wiping her tears. And I said, well, what'd you think? She says, oh, I loved it. I said, you loved it? And I could not understand. She said, only one thing. And I said, what? She says, the sad thing is, I only wished I could have been that little boy's mother. She had missed everything.
Oh, dear.
So when people decide they're going to write about their family, I said, don't worry, they're not going to recognize themselves. I went back to my teacher at the time, and I showed her the book. And the major character in the first draft of The View from Delphi was the little kid. It was Johnny. I didn't want my mom to miss it, so I named the kid my own name. And I punished this kid. I just had everything bad happen to him. I thought that's how you made readers be interested in your work, was to punish your characters and make your characters feel, and make your audience feel. So the teacher read halfway through the book, and I thought it was a masterpiece. And she says, I can't read anymore. She says, if you do one more, if one more bad thing happens to this kid, I'm going to kill him myself. She said, nobody wants to read about victims. She says, okay, you've gotten out all of your anger. Now go back and tell the real story of these people, which was a great learning. So for the next 2 years, I followed my parents around, and I looked at them as characters and not as failed parents. When I did that and looked at their own stories, I found that they were fascinating people. And there was some reconciliation in that they were still horrible parents, but I fell in love with them as characters in their own lives, in their own dramas, growing up the way they did in the 1940s and the 1950s. And them being honest with me about their stories gave me the book. So actually the first book was about, it was a spiritual journey, and it was also about reconciliation with my past. I was so arrogant when I started this book the first time, was that I have been saved, I have been healed, and I'm going to go back and shine the light on all of these racists, on all of these abusers. And through writing the book, I realized, no, those are my people, and that's still me. I'm still a racist who's dealing with it. I'm still a Southerner. I'm still a Mississippian. I still hate it, and I still love it. I hate my parents. I love my parents. I had to take the whole thing, and it was redemptive in the process.
You said something about your teacher or your coach saying, don't write about victims.
Right.
That just really resonates with me. And how did you create your character when you went back to the story so that he wasn't a victim?
Yeah, the breakthrough was my first agent actually told me this when she was reading the book, is that the first half of the book worked really well. And then the second half of the book, it was about my mother, and it's about my father, and it's about our neighborhood, and they became really cool characters. And the boy was kind of in the background. In the second half of the book, I had the mother get on drugs and be put away upstairs in the bedroom. You didn't see her for the rest of the book. Then the boy got abused. And my agent said, you're going to have to decide, is this your mother's story or is this your story? Because you can't be both. You can't put away this character, this mother you spent a book on that everybody's interested in, and then warehouse her. And then have the child abused. And it's like that just jerks the story, because now the reader has to have some resolution around the kid. So your story forks. And what it got down to was, psychologically, I did not want that child to go into that bedroom with that mother. I wanted her to stay hidden away. And the agent suggested have the child go into the room with the mother. And when I forced the child and the mother and the child to have a conversation, the book came alive. It was like me as a person accepted who my mother was. As hard as it was, I was able to accept that loss. And then the child could go into the background, because the child got what he needed, and the mother's story continued. It was a very strange process.
Right. I'm just trying to put my head around how that would be to put yourself in the background again.
It was freeing, because it was almost like the child had to carry the story, like I did in my own family. Mm-hmm. He had to be the martyr. He had to feel everything. He had to do everything. He felt like everything he had to save everyone, while he never got saved. By putting the child in the room with the mother, then the mother reached out, and the mother acknowledged what the child was going through. And so the child didn't have to do that anymore. The child got to be a child. The child got to be impish. He got to be mischievous. He didn't have to be perfect anymore. It got to be interesting, mm-hmm. Rather than this carrying this heavy weight.
Or being a short adult.
You're right, exactly.
One of the things you talked about when you spoke to the Osseo Book Club was about the night of your birth and how
Right.
that informed your writing.
Right. When I decided to write the book, I knew I needed some historical background. So I was 45 years old and went back to the library that I grew up, my hometown, Laurel, Mississippi. And I said, I wonder what was going on the day that I was born. And I opened the paper on May the 9th, 1951, and there was a picture of a lynching. And it happened 4 blocks away from where my mother was giving birth to me, in the small town of Laurel, Mississippi, which is only 25,000 people. And I looked at this picture, and there were 1,000 white people on the lawn of the courthouse, which I played on the steps as a kid. And they were celebrating the electrocution of Willie McGee, a black man who was convicted of, supposedly, of raping a white woman. Everybody knew that it was a consensual relationship, but in 1951, that wouldn't stand. He had to go. So I said, my gosh. So I just went back and created, what was going on when I was born? And what I realized was, on the night that I was born, Willie McGee was getting lynched 4 blocks away. But if you go on to North Main Street, you'll see this house, which is a Chisholm mansion, in which I passed by at going to school every day, but didn't realize that when I was growing up, inside that was a maid. Her name was Bernice. And once in a while, she would bring her niece to help her clean. And the lady who ran the house was Miss Chisholm, whose husband ran the bank. And I didn't know this, but one day her niece came to clean and sneaked while nobody was looking and played on the grand piano. Miss Chisholm overheard and paid her way into Wilberforce College and then to Juilliard. That was Leontine Price. So this was going on when I was born. And also, if you go to the other side of town, at this time, the night that I was born, there's an amusement company called Sambo's Amusement Company. And this guy who ran it, we all knew when I was growing up. He had just come to town in 1951. He was a up and comer. He was a young businessman. He later became a Sunday school teacher. His name was Sam Bowers, and he was 10 years away from being the imperial wizard of the KKK. He was the movie that Mississippi Burning was about. He's the one who planned the death of the murder of the 3 civil rights workers. So what I discovered in writing the book, that all these things were happening on my doorstep, and I didn't find out about them until I was 45 years old. I mean, history. And so I went to my mother and I said, how come you didn't tell me about Willie McGee being, I looked and I found his picture that year on Time magazine. He was in the Christian Science Monitor. There were riots in Paris, France. Jean-Paul Sartre was on his side. Truman got involved. Einstein got involved. It was a cause célèbre everywhere in the country, and my parents never heard of it. 4 blocks away. And I looked at this newspaper article, all these parents and these people standing on the lawn, and those were my teachers, and those are the parents of my friends. Those were some of my friends. Little kids were on the lawn at midnight celebrating the death of this black man. Then I found out later, Bella Abzug, that was her first court case. Nobody in Mississippi would defend this man. So Bella Abzug, who'd never been in a courtroom before, came down to Mississippi pro bono, volunteered her time. And the backstory is the crowds, the mobs in Mississippi saw this young white Jewish woman from up north defending this black man, and they chased her down. She was pregnant at the time and aborted her baby hiding in the bus station in Laurel, Mississippi, my hometown.
Dear.
So all these stories started coming out. And Josephine Baker, the great artiste from Paris, came into Mississippi and gave Willie McGee's mother her mink stoles. Nobody wrote about these stories, so I'm putting them together. And the major story was, how did I not know this? And I talked to other Southern friends, white friends, and they had the same story no matter where they lived. All this stuff happened on our doorsteps, and we didn't even know it. Martin Luther King marched through our town. We didn't even know it. So that became the theme of the book. How can, as a child, you grow up in a white bubble? What does it take to create that bubble so that you don't see black folks? And how do you know at that early an age that you're not supposed to see it? That's a secret. What is that? I learned, I had to go back and plumb my own memories. And in Mississippi, in Laurel, Mississippi, is half black and half white. With a small town, Northerners don't understand, when they hear segregation, they think, oh, blacks and whites are separated. You can't separate blacks and whites in a small southern town. We're like this. Whites and blacks are together every day intimately. So I saw blacks in my home, cleaning the home. We saw blacks in a yard. They were everywhere. I didn't go to school with them. That was against the law. And we went to the movie theaters. The blacks sat upstairs in what they call the buzzard's roost, and the whites sat downstairs so we could wave at each other. And we saw each other in the grocery stores. So we're intimately connected. And it wasn't until I remember, when did I learn that color was important? And I was about 6 years old. And this memory came to me as I was writing, and I was sitting in the backyard, and it was a hot, hot day, and the next yard there was a man raking straw. He was an elderly man, black man, and I remember being curious because it was so hot, and this man was wearing a flannel shirt, and nobody did that. None of my friends did that. They always either went without shirts or wore really thin shirts, and I didn't notice he was black or white. That really didn't impressed me one way or the other. It was that flannel shirt that he was wearing. He was sweating. So I walked over to him and I says, how come you're wearing a hot shirt on a hot day? And he says, oh, well, it says when it's hot and you sweat like this and the wind blows, it's like air conditioning. So I thought, well, that's just the wisdom of the ages. So we started having this conversation. And the woman who hired him, our next door neighbor, who I loved dearly, her name was Miss Helen Callahan, and I called her Miss Helen because she was an elderly person, and you learned as a child that everybody has their nomenclature. Elderly women and men are called Miss and Mr. and their first name. people your parents' age are Mr. in their last name, Mr. Johnson or Miss Johnson, but elderly or Miss Helen or Mr. Bill. And women were never Mrs., they're always Miss. They've been married 7 times, they're still, and they're 80 years old, still they're Miss Helen. So she comes down and she says, what are y'all doing? I wanted to mind my manners because she always told me manners were important. And she took me under her wing. She wanted me to grow up to be a young Southern gentleman. So she would tell me not to talk with my mouth full or keep my elbows off a table when I had dinner at her house. And so I wanted to impress her. So I said, I'm talking to Mr. Joe. She says, oh no, honey, Joe's not a Mr., Joe's a nigger. And in that moment, I knew something important had happened. Now, Miss Helen was one of those Christian people in our neighborhood. And she went to church every day. She was gentle. And even in that tone of voice, it was a caring, that's the craziness about the South. It's not that we say the word nigger, is that we can say the word in a way that doesn't sound hateful. That's what makes a child crazy. She said the word as an endearment. But I knew something had happened important because she was, and I looked up at Joe just to see if he was okay with it. And of course, he was nodding his head, saying, yes, that's right, because he couldn't say anything differently. He'd be lynched. So what I realized in that moment, a curtain kind of went up in my understanding. Oh, that's why there's Colored Town it stinks all the time because they don't have sewers and they don't have paved roads. And that's why the black kids go to that fallen down school and the white kids that I'm going to go to a really nice brick air-conditioned school. And that's why when I go to a restaurant, I get to eat in the air-conditioned part, and blacks have to eat in the alley and have their food shoved out through a window in the wall. And all of a sudden it made sense. I thought it was arbitrary before. Then I realized, no, it's because of skin color. That's it. And my skin color is somehow better, and Joe's is somehow not as good. And in that moment also I learned his story is not important. He doesn't get to be a mister. So in that moment, Joe, along with my maid, along with every other black person I knew, started to recede into the background of my life. They became the background. Their story was of no importance. It was the white story that was important. It only mattered. And then the blacks became just functionaries in my life, not individuals. And that's the way that's the way you create Jim Crow, because you can't create segregation. You can't keep blacks and whites apart physically. The only thing that works is to keep them apart psychologically. So at a young age, we are trained into psychological segregation, which still exists in our country today, because we still see blacks as that kind of, a lot of us still do, as that background in life, those poor people, or the underprivileged, or the or the whatever, hardly ever as individuals. So I realized it wasn't until I got to Minnesota and started sobering up and dealing with my own issues. It was 6 years of sobriety, and I dealt with being gay, and I confronted my parents around the child stuff of growing up, brought them up to therapy. They sat in my therapist's office and let me yell at them and scream at them and have all my memories. And they didn't agree with me, but they never left, which I love them for forever. And as soon as I was dealing with that, I said, okay, I got it made. I'm a young man. I'm a young gay man. I'm out. I'm proud. I've got money. Great. So I'm sitting down. It was 1988, and I'm sitting down in front of the TV. And it was April the 4th, and it was the 20th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And that was all that was on TV, so I turned it on Channel 2. You know, I saw all this stuff when I was growing up as a kid on Huntley Brinkley and on Walter Cronkite and all the black and white still. It was like, oh yeah, those black people marching. I heard about that. That's history. But this time I started watching, and they were marching through my hometown. There was King, there was Abernathy, Stokely Carmichael. And for the first time I took my eyes off of them and looked at the people on the side of the road. And these are the white people throwing the rocks and waving the Confederate flags and yelling the epithets. And then it went, oh my God, those are my people. This isn't black history. This is white history. This is my history. This is the part that I missed and yet shaped me. So that then I became determined in my book to go back and not just learn the white story, but how the white story was created by the black story, and how the black story was created by the white story, and how blacks and whites together created the story of race. So when I knew that I wrote my book, I wanted to have as many black characters as I had white characters. And I had a really good friend at the time, a black man. When I told him I was going to write this book about Mississippi and have a lot of black characters, he said, "Oh, good, exactly what we need. Another white man writing the story about black people." He says, "If you insist on doing it, though," he says, do a favor." He says, "Don't write another To Kill a Mockingbird." And I said, "Well, that's my goal. I want to write another To Kill a Mockingbird. I think that was a wonderful book." And I said, "White liberals love that." And he says, "Yeah, I know, but black people hate that book." And I said, "Why?" He says, "John," he says, "I refuse to let my girls pick up that book because we're far enough along that I do not want them reading one more book about one more black person who needs being saved by a white person. We have our own heroes, you know. We don't need saving." And he talked about other books that have come out. It's always the same story when white folks write about black folks. We build sympathy for the black folks, then we have this white hero, an Atticus Finch, or the newspaper writer from The Help, or whatever. They need us as agents for their own freedom. He says, we don't. In fact, why don't we have our own heroes? Why don't you write a black hero who saves a white person? That'd be a nice change. So when he said that, I went down south and I realized he's right. There are books and books and books of heroism in the black community about them saving themselves, about them getting their own freedom, about them forcing white segregationists to back down. That white people didn't do that for them; they did it for themselves. And so I just learned how. And they weren't big preachers. They weren't theologians. They were maids, and they were field workers, and they were illiterates, and they were the ones who stood up to the white man when all they had to lose was their lives, just because they wanted their children to have the education they didn't have. And I was inspired. I thought, oh my God, these are heroes. So that all that went into shaping that first book. So the theme is all the victims, there were no more victims. All the victims became agents in their own life.
How did you come to write The Healing?
Yeah, the first book, I must have 100 hours worth of interviews that I did with field workers, with people who had stood in the road with King when he walked through their town, to family of martyrs, people who we'll never know the name of. And when I go into a black community, they were always open to me, unlike a lot of white people, because I wasn't there to do a sociological study. I wasn't there to save them. I was there, I made it really clear, I'm here because my story got really screwed up, and I don't even know who I am. And I don't think I'm going to know who I am until I know who you are, because I think your story helped create me. And as long as I was willing, I was telling them I needed help for my own redemption, they started opening up. It was kind of like, well, they were clear they didn't need to be saved by me, and they didn't need to be talked down to me, but they said, honey, if you're broken, I'm a Christian, and my job as a Christian is to help heal you, so what do you need? So they started opening up these stories, and they said, oh, you need to go talk to so-and-so, he's got a story, or she's got a story. And they kept leading me to these people who were midwives. And I couldn't find a place in my first book for them because they were mystifying me. Midwives that, when I was growing up, what I was taught were midwives, black midwives, were abortionists, or they were very dirty, or they were ignorant, or they were superstitious. They were jokes. And yet when I talked to these African Americans in Mississippi, when they talked about midwives, they talk about Mother Polly or Mother Sue or Mother who, they'd start crying. I mean, they didn't just talk about them on a physical level, like she helped catch my baby or deliver my baby. It was like, she's a mother to me. She's part of our community. I love her. It was this deep, deep emotion. And then I went and talked to these midwives, and I was blown away. That was not what I was expecting. They were the closest thing to saints on earth that I've ever met. And not this kind of obsequious or scraping and bowing. They were strong. They were fierce, and yet they were blessed, and they so after the first book came out and I started looking for, I wanted a black hero. I wanted to tell what other, so I said, okay, these midwives won't leave me alone. So I started doing my own studying. And I found out the midwives in Mississippi, as every other southern state, it's a very fascinating story, is that black midwives were, up until the 1930s and 40s, were the backbone of the health services given to black women, because white doctors weren't interested in black bodies, and plus black people didn't trust white doctors because they still have history from the plantation days when they were treated like livestock, or they were bled or given leeches, or they were given all these caustic pharmaceuticals. They were treated horribly, and this memory pervades their history. And even up until 1960, it was permissible for white doctors to give black women, to sterilize them without even telling them they were doing that. It was a part of our eugenics law in this country. The white doctor was given the authority to decide if a black woman was worthy to have children or not. And if not, he would give them a hysterectomy. He would sterilize them and not even tell them, and they didn't even know why they couldn't have children. So there was no wonder that blacks didn't trust whites. So after the Civil War and after freedom, black women, out of necessity, older black women kind of rose up out of the community. They were wise women, or maybe they had some knowledge of roots or herbal remedies. Maybe they had delivered a lot of children, but they were the go-to people for families who were looking to have children, for mothers who were pregnant, for women who couldn't have children, who weren't successful at that, and also for women who didn't know how to take care of children after they were birthed. So these women became integral into these homes, and they would help raise the mothers in a way. And when in the 1930s and 1940s, when money started being put into public health services, then the white medical institutions became interested again in black bodies because there was money in it. And so they put white doctors in there and opened their offices, and the black women wouldn't come to them. And when they did, their experience was horrible. It was like they had to walk into a cold, sterile office, and if they needed to deliver, it was on the doctor's time, because that's why Western medicine was. Well, let's see, we have a 4 o'clock, so we're going to induce labor on you. Or they give them a prescription for some medicine. They couldn't read the prescription, didn't have money to go to the drugstore, even if the drugstore would handle it. And then they had to go back and maybe into their own impoverished home, which the doctor had no idea about how these people were living. He was prescribing medicine when they didn't even have food. So it was like a total miss. Talk about not knowing your audience. So they kept up with these black midwives. Well, then the white medical establishment decided to play hardball. So they started getting in league with the state legislatures and started passing licensure laws for these black midwives, one of which right away eliminated most of them. They said you had to be able to read. And then if you were passed, you had to work under the supervision of a doctor. And then you had to let go of all these other procedures that you did. If there was trouble, you had to have a doctor there. So they became controlled. So the old black midwives got pushed aside. So when I started looking at these, and still I thought that was probably a good thing, because still my mind was they were superstitious, they were dirty. Still, that hadn't changed my mind until I started looking at the studies in the 1950s and 1960s, when they started comparing success rates between the white doctors and the black midwives. And the black midwives had a success rate 3 times as high, 3 times the live birth rate as the white doctors. And then that blew me away, because I'm a scientist. I went, how can that, there's the story. Whatever that story is, that's the story. And then what I found out, of course, it was faith and it was trust. And also a midwife, if she's helping this mother deliver, she probably delivered her. She probably delivered her mother and maybe an aunt. So if there's any problems in the family, genetically or physically, she probably already knew about that. And plus the black midwife shows up 2 months before the due date. So they know what kind of house they're living in. They know if they're going to have food. If they don't have food, they get it. If the mother is too young to understand how to take care of a child, the midwife is there until the mother successfully does that. So the midwife not only births a child, but births a child into the community. And that's when I realized these were heroes. These were people who we don't talk about, who got shamed and got put aside, who got pushed aside. And the deeper I studied, the more I found that these women held entire communities together. They were the souls of these communities, even more than the black preachers were. In fact, I interviewed the first black mayor of my hometown, Laurel, Mississippi, and I asked him, I said, what was your biggest accomplishment? What is the thing you're most proud of? And I thought he was going to say running away from the Klan, which he did, or getting an education in a white college, which he did, overcoming prejudice in this small town, which he did. But the first thing he said, he didn't even think about it. He says, I was caught by Miss Katie. And I said, what do you mean you were caught? And he says, Miss Katie was my midwife. I said, but you don't remember. He says, no, but I know her. She birthed me. She caught me. She was there with my mother. And he started tearing up. There's a connection there that's more than just physical. Is that what I found out later was that every year on Miss Katie's birthday, all her children, thousands of the children that she birthed came to her birthday. They were a big family, an extended family. It was tradition that they knew went back not just to Jim Crow and not just to slavery days, but all the way back to Africa. This wise woman in the community who was there for everyone, for their needs. So that's when I realized I needed to find a midwife like that. That's the midwife I wanted to talk about. Just incidentally, I also found out Miss Katie later on was Leontine Price's mother. So when black people in Mississippi, in Laurel, Mississippi, talk about Leontine Price, they're proud. They just, their chests go out. She came from us. But to talk about Miss Katie, they start crying because she touches a different part of their soul. And I wanted to recreate that on the page. I wanted a woman like that. So I found one and spent some time with her, and she gave me the voice that I needed.
There's so much that you talked about in Osseo that I'm not quite sure what to ask you. Could you talk about the rewrite that you're doing on Delphi?
Delphi came out in 2004 with a small press, McAdam Cage. They were kind of a boutique press. They found a lot of Southern authors. And they didn't have any money for marketing. We did okay. But then 2010, when Random House picked up The Healing, they gave it a much bigger treatment. So I got a bigger audience. So my agent, Marley Rusoff, who's lucky to find her, she actually is from Minneapolis. She started The Loft and then went on to New York, and her client list includes Pat Conroy and some other, Ron Rash, some great Southern writers. So somehow I got her. And she read The View from Delphi. And since that time, that publisher went under. But I was able to get my rights back. So I hold the rights to Delphi. And she says, this is a wonderful book. She says, I'm so angry that nobody knew about this book, and it came out 6 years before The Help. She said, in my opinion, this is so much better. And it's so much more respectful to the African Americans in it. They're not portrayed as these poor victims, they're fighters. She said, we got to get this book out again. I said, great. And she said, I think it needs to be shorter, because I learned a lot in writing the second book about writing. One is that I love to include everything in my books. I love the scenery, I love the South, I love the history. So as you can tell, even the way I talk, I take tangents everywhere. And that's what my first book is, just full of tangents. I loved it, I love the stories. But that's not for the modern reader. The modern reader wants a story they can follow through, and it moves really rapidly. And so she says, let's do a rewrite. Let's keep the same plot, same characters, but let's see what we can do about it. And as I looked at it, I realized the way that I write is almost systematic. It's the way that I used to teach classes, teach executives. What I would do, I would tell them what I was going to tell them. Then I told them what I told them. And that's how you keep a live audience's attention, but that's not how you keep, the reader is going to get bored. They don't want to, just tell me the story. Don't tell me about the story. So by just cutting out all they're beautifully written, they're my favorite pieces sometimes. I think as Faulkner says, you really have to learn to kill your darlings. And so I let go of, and now we're down from 500 pages to 370 pages. And it moves, it's a better book. It moves faster. And we're going to rename it. And the first book was A View from Delphi, which is a complicated name to remember and ask for in a bookstore. And I just fell in love with the name. It was personal. A lot of reasons for it, but the reader wouldn't appreciate. So Marley said, you know, your book is actually, it was marketed as kind of a Faulknerian, blood and guts, kind of hard-edged Mississippi book, and it's not. I write for women. My characters are women. Those are the ones that come to me and talk. So she says it's about relationship among women, and yours is a relationship between black and white women, and that's what you need to talk. That's what the title needs to be. And I said, I want to make sure this time people understand that the black women in this are not victims. They're the ones who are running the show. It's about their heroism. She said, we'll put that in the title. So the title of the new book is going to be Miss Hazel and the Rosa Parks League. It's a group of maids who turn a town upside down in the 1950s, about the same time that Rosa Parks is doing her demonstrations over next door in Montgomery, Alabama. They hear about this woman and are inspired about her and start to play out this activism on a local level in their own neighborhood. So Miss Hazel is the white woman who actually the black maids have a hand in saving her because she's pretty well given up. She's a typical, she was my mother in the 1950s where, you know, she has all this artistic ability, all this sense of soaring ambition, but nowhere to put it. All they'll let her do is be a housewife. And eventually she buckles under that image of having to, and my mother, I don't think, wanted to be a mother that much. I don't think she wanted to be a housewife. I think she wanted to be an artist. I think she wanted to be a writer, but it wasn't available. So Miss Hazel lives through that. She has her own oppression.
That sounds like it's going to be really exciting. I'm looking forward to reading the book again
Thanks.
in the new format. We're getting down to the end of our time. Is there anything else that I've missed asking you, or anything else you'd like to tell us about? Anything new projects in the works?
Yeah, I have got this memoir that all the pieces are there. I need help with structure, so I had friends reading the book and some other writers. But it's a book about when I came out with Delphi and started doing book readings, people were interested in what are the stories behind the stories. And so then I started telling the stories like the ones that I've been telling you. And now having friends, especially African-American friends, who said, you need to write your stories down. You need to write about what it's like to grow up racist, honestly, and what it's like to deal with that. And write about the differences that you find in the South and in Minnesota. She says, we'd love to read your stories. So I'm trying to put those stories about, calling it, kind of working title is growing up gay, fundamentalist, racist, and white in Mississippi, or God, what were you thinking? So it'll be a collection of personal essays.
Oh, that's
so hopefully that'll be out next year sometimes after we release Miss Hazel.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much,
Oh,
John
sure.
Odell, for taking the time to speak with us today.
I have enjoyed it very much, so Ellen.
And this is the end of BookBeat for today. We look forward to seeing you next time. I'm trying something new today. I've got my questions on my phone. Good afternoon and welcome to BookBeat. Reading books is the key to an enlightened society. You want a key light back there, right?
Just gonna borrow this.
I think we're about ready, aren't we, Jesse? Good. BookBeat is a show about books and book readers.
A very odd combination of topics.
We interview book club members. How are your books chosen? And film their discussions.
Trying to find happiness and love in her life.
We also provide tips for forming book clubs
I think you just have to find a group of interested book readers.
and books that are current that might be enjoyable to read. in a society where everything is instantaneous, we're losing that sense of depth that reading can bring that other media doesn't. My name is Sue Ellen Zagrabelny.
Well, I can't guarantee Oprah, but I can guarantee Channel 20.
Look for Book Beat, Sundays at 5 p.m., repeated Monday at 1 a.m. and 9 a.m. on Channel 20. See you then.
Thank you.